Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Dennis Sanders to the show. A native of Flint, Michigan, Dennis is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He received his bachelor's in journalism from Michigan State University and his master's of divinity from Luther Seminary. He's been a communication professional working for various nonprofits for over 20 years. From 2008 until 2013, he was the associate pastor at First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Minneapolis. Since 2013, he's been the pastor of First Christian Church of St. Paul in Roseville, Minnesota. He lives in Minneapolis with his husband, Daniel. All right, welcome to the show, Reverend Dennis Sanders. Thanks for being here. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, besides, I grew up in a town that it seems like everyone knows, Flint, Michigan. That was my hometown, but both my parents were auto workers for General Motors, which was the thing you did back in the 70s and 80s. It's always interesting kind of going back to Michigan, especially southeastern Michigan, to see how things are changing, and sometimes for the good. I think these days probably more for the good than for the bad. But there are still a lot of challenges that Flint is dealing with. Of course, the ramifications from the water crisis a few years ago.
Yeah.
But also from just the changes in the American economy and in American manufacturing. So it's always just fascinating to kind of come back and see how is the town kind of dealing with all of those changes.
Yeah. Share, if you would, kind of about your journey of faith, what that looked like, growing up, what that looks like today, what may or may not have changed for you.
Yeah. I grew up, I would say, in two traditions at the same time. That would be the Black church and then also evangelicalism. And I think that both of them were incredibly kind of foundational to me, probably in ways that I wouldn't have kind of realized. I think for me growing up, the whole point of, or the way that you would kind of see yourself as a Christian was, I would say, kind of that whole kind of what people would be calling today decision theology, that you would make a decision to follow Christ and to be born again. And I don't put that down. I don't see it that way as much anymore. I think going into seminary, and especially because I went to a Lutheran seminary, just kind of understanding the concept of grace and of God, and the whole point of the action that took place on the cross is really the quote unquote decision. It wasn't really on my part. It was something that happened in God through Jesus, and that things like our baptism is a way of that, saying yes to that, of knowing that you are welcomed into that. But I also want to respect that where I came from, because I think that faith helped me, especially as I got older, coming to terms with my sexuality and being gay. That understanding of God's love, even then from that background, I think helped me to not reject my faith, which I think so many people, because they came from, I think, really, I want to say, more shame-based backgrounds, sometimes ended up, it was just very hard for them to accept Christianity as a whole, or they had to leave the faith and then come back. And I never really had to do that because I never felt that God didn't love me. Even if I was not doing something I thought then that was acceptable to God, I didn't think God was like, well, you're done. And so coming into that and then understanding more about grace and into mainline Protestantism and into grace, I was able to kind of hold on to that faith. And so while I think I'm at a different place than I used to be, I don't discard what I grew up with, because I think it helped me be who I am. And I think it got me through that transition.
Yeah. Dennis, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but from my thinking, at least, and I've heard this from others too, like it really is important to try to find a way to make peace, to reconcile your kind of past. Even if for me, at least, I'm definitely in a far different place than I was theologically growing up, but I've come to like find an appreciation for, even if sometimes I chuckle at myself.
Yeah, I want to be careful in what I say, because I know that there have been people that have been hurt by their faith.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you also don't want to just hold on to that hurt. And I think sometimes that's become kind of fashionable to kind of hold on to that, but that doesn't help you. It doesn't allow you to grow in your faith. It doesn't allow you to move forward. And so it's, at some point you have to kind of reckon with that past, and then kind of, you're never going to forget it, but you have to kind of let go and kind of accept God's grace. Because sometimes I feel that holding on is a barrier to accepting God's love.
That's interesting. I'm just kind of curious, like, again, as someone who grew up outside the mainline Protestant tradition, how did you find yourself? How did you get into the mainline Protestant tradition?
Well, it was actually towards the end of college, and I think I was questioning a lot of kind of the tenets and beliefs or things that within evangelicalism that just didn't ring true as much. And as I said, it was also as I was coming to terms with my own sexuality, and so that made me kind of looking towards, okay, are there other parts of Christianity that would be more accepting, or at least more understanding? And I visited and looked at many different churches, and I found, I think, a good place for a few years it was a American Baptist, and it was actually American / Southern Baptist in DC, Calvary Baptist Church, that I think was a good place and a good kind of entry point into mainline Protestantism. And I think a few years later, I discovered the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and really liked their tradition. And that's kind of where I ended up as a pastor.
Yeah. Well, Dennis and I are both proud clergy in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So shout out to our friends in the DOC. Before we get off track here, Dennis, I won't ask you more questions, but share if you would, any spiritual practices that have been meaningful for you or you might recommend others.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, is for spiritual practices have always been a challenge for me. I think partially, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with both ADHD, and I'm also on the autism spectrum. What that means is it's just kind of hard to, there are people who will say, well, I've sat still for 30 minutes and it was such a enriching moment. And it's like, that doesn't work for me. Because within 5 minutes, I'm kind of, looking or trying to do this or that. And I think one of the things that has helped is I listen each day to something. It's the daily prayer, which is the morning prayer from a group called Forward Movement. And this is an organization. It's a parachurch organization, but it was founded by Episcopalians back actually in the 30s, that kind of to help Episcopalians in their daily walk. And they have several podcasts out there. A morning prayer one. They have one in the evening. They have a one that's a devotional. And so I listen to the morning prayer podcast. And that has been kind of helpful to kind of listen to that. It's kind of the best way for me to kind of understand, or at least to be able to kind of listen and to engage Scripture and to have that kind of a practice. In the past, I listened to another podcast. It was Pray As You Go, which I believe it's put out by, I want to say British Jesuits.
I've done that myself in the past.
Yeah, I think that's another great podcast, and I've really enjoyed that one too.
Yeah.
But the podcast allows me to kind of to not sit still, but also to listen. The other thing that I really enjoy as a spiritual practice, and I haven't done it as much lately, but I think it's important, are kind of contemplative prayer services like Taizé. I think it's that kind of repeating and kind of rote way that it's set up allows me to kind of enter in a way that I'm not always able to do if it were just me sitting still and being silent. So those are kind of the things that I think work for me. It feels like everything for me, any type of spiritual practice has to be kind of kinetic in nature for me to kind of actually pick it up.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So I had Dennis on because he just recently led his church through a pretty big transition, and I think a transition that more and more churches are going to be facing in the coming years, I imagine. And that was selling a building. And I thought it'd be a really intriguing conversation to kind of hear someone who just went through the process and what lessons they learned and what advice they might have. So, Dennis, I thought maybe to start out, if you would kind of share about the church, kind of the story of the church and how it got to, where it was.
Yeah. I am the pastor of First Christian Church of St. Paul, which kind of pretty much tells you kind of where its beginnings were. It was the Disciples of Christ congregation that was started in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it has been around since about 1882. So
wow.
We're saying 140 years old. It used to be not too far from downtown St. Paul. And like a lot of mainline Protestant churches, it got to a point where it was smaller than it used to be, and they couldn't really maintain that building anymore. So they sold it to a college and moved in the mid-90s and moved to Matamidi, which is a suburb about 10 miles north of St. Paul. I got to the church in 2013, and by the time I was there, it was a pretty small congregation. And so that was kind of where we were at. And I can kind of tell you at the point that I was there for a few months, I kind of started to think that maybe this is not going to be the best place for this church to be. But
so
I think at that time,
pretty early your time there, you recognize that.
Yeah.
And
okay. kind of floated the idea with one of the members, and it sounded like there was a little hesitancy. And I think
Yeah.
knowing I had already gone through or worked with a prior congregation, actually just down the road, First Christian of Minneapolis, had done a move.
Mm-hmm.
I both thought that might make sense, but I was also aware of kind of not the dangers, but the challenges of moving. And so I didn't really did not do anything for a few years to kind of try to see if maybe something can happen if we still stay here. During that time, the church had gone through, as I said, a lot of people had left during the prior pastor's time.
Mm-hmm.
And that also resulted in a lot of deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of problems that started to crop up with the building. And the church also had a parsonage that they had to keep up. For a few years, we had nested. We had another congregation, a kind of conservative Baptist congregation that shared the church, and the pastor's son, one of his sons, it was a place for them to have a home, so they were able to stay, and so they paid us rent. And so we got rent from that and from the church.
Yeah.
But both buildings had problems, so we had to always kind of, fix this little thing, fix that thing.
Right.
And then flash forward to late 2020 or 2021, after kind of not meeting in the church for a year or so, getting back into the church, and also kind of seeing, I think, where there were some things that had happened during that time period of the pandemic that made us think that maybe it is time finally for us to look into selling the building. Right. And so throughout 2021, we did start meeting with realtors. We start just to find out, what is the property worth? Would this person want to go forward and helping us to sell the building? But we still kind of did not move forward. We were still kind of in a holding pattern, but we were starting to think about it and to really entertain the idea that maybe it was time to sell the building.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious, what were some of the key discussions or conversations that were had amongst, again, leadership, and again, for people coming from different church contexts, governance, polity contexts, that's going to look different. But for your context, what were some of those key conversations that were had?
Well, one of the conversations, and this had been an issue for as long as I can remember, and probably even before that, was the building wasn't accessible at all.
ADA accessible, right?
Yes, exactly. So there was no, you immediately enter into the building and there were these very steep stairs. And so that made it difficult for, we're not even just talking about people that used wheelchairs, but we had several
folks with limited mobility.
Exactly. And who it was just hard to get up those stairs. And so, and to try to do anything that would have required remodeling the building would have been incredibly extensive and and expensive.
Yeah.
So that was an issue that we were starting to think about, is that was also in many ways, I think, hindering our growth, because there were people who might have been interested in being in visiting, but if you can't get up the stairs, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And our bathrooms, of course, also were not ADA compliant, so that was also an issue. So that was one of the initial discussions, was about that problem, that it was just hard to get into that building. And I think it was also, for a lot of people, it was hard to find because we were kind of up on a hill, on a road, so we weren't incredibly visible for people to see us. So that was an issue. And also even just kind of the look of the, again, because this had been, I would say, many years of deferred maintenance, you could tell that it was rather run down in how it was looking. So it made it very difficult to do, I think, just to do effective ministry in the building. Is some of the problems.
Yeah. So what did it look like? Like, I mean, was there like a congregational vote? We're like, let's do this. What was kind of like a key tipping point?
The key tipping point actually came in early 2022. And actually, it was just the January 2nd, so the day after New Year's. I get someone from the other congregation tells us that they may not survive. There were some issues going on internally in their congregation.
This church that was renting from you.
Yes, and kind of providing a substantial portion of our budget. And we didn't have a huge amount of budget, period, because we didn't have a huge amount of people.
Right.
So all of a sudden, we no longer, and it happened suddenly. I mean, he tells us this, and then next Sunday or 2 Sundays, they don't meet.
Wow.
And we just find out they're done. And it wasn't here's our closing worship service or anything to that extent. It was just boom.
Wow.
So yeah. And, we were able to work with them to at least get the rent for that final month. On top of that, we had the family that had been renting in the house had moved to their own home a year prior. And we had someone come in, kind of working through a nonprofit that was helping on dealing with people who were facing or dealing with homelessness. So that there was a mother and her family that were renting, but that had its issues. So we had to actually stop that a few months prior. So that lost that income.
Yeah.
And so immediately then we had besides the income that we were getting from our own people, not a whole much out there. And we only had maybe only a few more months to go before we were done. So that kind of made the decision of, we need to really just move forward with this now. And so that's where I immediately started engaging realtors. We had kind of a small group of people that were coming together and meeting with people, and slowly but surely we found a realtor that we wanted to go with and move forward with. And the decision was not as much a board decision as it was a decision of the trustees, because they were the ones that had the power on issues concerning the selling of property or any type of proceeds and all of that. So we worked to get them on board, and the majority got on board with that. And we were able to then have a realtor who was able to kind of put the property on the market. That was, I think, by late March of 2022.
So y'all are moving pretty quick.
Yes.
Pretty quick. Now I'm curious, like, many churches I can imagine, when faced with such a scenario, would just be like, you know what? We've had a good run here. Let's just fold up shop, call it good, close the church. What was like, what is it about your church would you say is like, why? Obviously, there's something they still believe is worth keeping going. Talk about kind of that energy and what kind of can't think of the word here, deciphering, decision making there was around, why we want to keep going. Discernment, that's the word.
Yeah.
I'm looking for.
It's interesting. I think that there are a lot of people there that they still want to be church. They still want to do and come together for worship, even though they're few in number. And I think that there is some type of, I don't know, the only word that's coming to mind, well, it's stubbornness in some ways.
Yeah.
Of we want to stay together. And then, of course, you had a pastor who either is a little bit crazy or not, that wanted to keep this church alive. And that I still believe that God can still use this congregation.
Yeah.
And, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue in the same way it does everything.
Right.
But I still think that there is a need for this congregation. And I don't feel like God has said anything like, oh, it's time to go.
Yeah.
So I think that those two factors really kind of factored in. And it was really helpful. We had, in December of last year, our regional minister came to worship with us. And, I shared something about how, we're kind of a small congregation. And he shared a story about one of his prior calls, which was to a small congregation of maybe like 12 people in West Virginia, and how incredibly faithful they were, and how incredibly willing they were to kind of be in service to their surrounding community. And I think that was encouragement, that we may be a small in number, but that doesn't mean that we need to close up or give up. I think God can do a lot with small things, and that seems to actually be God's MO. Throughout the Bible.
Yep. Thinking of the Gideon story, is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to ask about kind of like some real practical, like kind of liturgies, things around leaving the building. But kind of before I ask that, I'm kind of curious, like, do you think having that prior history of selling a building, moving from downtown St. Paul, you said, to kind of the burbs, 30 years ago-ish?
Yep.
Do you think that helped, kind of like the institutional memory of that having happened in the past, helped this willingness to say, hey, we can do transitions?
I think that it does. I mean, I don't think that there's only maybe one or two people that are still there that were part of that initial move back in the mid 90s, but I think that memory is still there.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that there was as much of I think that there wasn't as much of a barrier to it because we had done it before, and it was within recent memory. It wasn't something that happened, 50 years ago, but something that happened 30. And so I think that did make it somewhat easier because we had done a move before, and we could do it again. Didn't make it easier,
right?
But we could do it. Yeah.
Well, share, what are some like liturgies, rituals you did around like when the end was near, last Sunday type thing?
Well, one of the things that we did, and I think has become a thing, because around this time, two other churches were selling their buildings, that were disciple churches in the Twin Cities. Interesting. One of them has since closed. I think they're decommissioning. Their service was decommissioning the building and closing, but the other one is still kind of a question mark. But the whole thing of a decommissioning service which I see as becoming something that at least has been done within disciples. I don't know if that's throughout the denomination, but at least in the upper Midwest. And it's a way of saying that the service that this building once was used for is no longer. And so that's something that we did. We did that on July 24th of this year. We had someone from the region come up to be a part of that. And so we went through all of, the saying goodbye, closing that chapter of it. And I think it was important for people. And it was a way of saying that this chapter of the life of the church was over, but the church itself wasn't over. But we did need to have that sense of closing this part of the life of that church. And I think that was helpful. I think that any church, if they're selling their building and moving, should consider doing that, because I think it offers a break between where you were and where you are now. And hopefully even to open up to trying and doing different things than you would have beforehand.
Yeah. Let me shift gears here a little bit in the conversation. We've been talking kind of theoretical. I want to hear some practical things. And again, you don't need to share here dollars and cents specifics, but I'm curious, kind of like, as much as you can or are willing to share about your church's plan for the proceeds, and then like what advice or what would you advise other churches to do? What did your church do? And then I'm also kind of curious, like, did you put any like kind of guardrails in place? I've seen in some situations like a church sells their building and basically just like draws down all the funds and then closes 5-10 years later. Like, what are your thoughts around that situation?
Well, one of the things that was helpful for me is that I had gone through this before because I was the associate pastor at First Christian of Minneapolis. And Minneapolis sold their building in 2008, and they had a pastor there, an interim pastor, Bob Bright, who I think he's one of those few pastors, I think, that has a great mind for money and money management. And so his whole thing was to set up working with our denominational agencies, our church extension fund, and then our foundation, to set up accounts that would be that would grow over time. And they would also be accounts that we could set up that would allow us to withdraw a certain amount, usually the interest that had accrued from an account, to help sustain our budget year to year. So that's kind of where I'm working with our trustees right now, and they are hopefully they're chatting with people with Church Extension, our fund for the disciples, and for the Christian Church Foundation, so that we're not simply just drawing down on our funds, but hopefully having them invested, and hopefully then to have them to use to help our budget for years to come. Because I think the danger is to just draw it down, and then you're going to be in the same situation just a few years later, and that's not helpful.
Yeah. How about some, like, I don't know if you have anything that you'd say like went wrong in your situation, but I can imagine there's some things where like, well, that could have gone wrong, or that was a danger area. What are some thoughts you might have on that? Some words of warning.
I think for me early on, it would be that if you're a pastor and you're coming into a building, into a situation with a building and a ministry, And if you're there for a few months and you feel this building isn't working, you need to talk to them then.
Yeah, that's good.
Not that I think it's great that we were able to kind of do it what we did, but I feel like in some ways I waited way too long until it kind of was a crisis that we had to do it.
Yeah.
And we were slowly moving in that direction, but I think it would have made it would have been better had we had done this 4 or 5 years ago, instead of kind of waiting. And I think part of it is you don't want to, as a pastor, rock the boat all the time.
Right.
But this was a boat that needed rocking. And obviously it came to a point where we had to do it. And there just wasn't any there wasn't any other decision. So I think for any other pastor, if you're there and you feel your gut is saying this isn't working, you need to talk to your church board or session or whatever governing body that you have and bring this up.
Okay, so you've been in 2 of these scenarios. Give some practical, warning, red flags. I don't know what the right word would be. A lot of hey, your gut's right here.
Yeah, I think, the other thing is make sure that you do have some guardrails. Make sure you have a plan on what you're going to do with the proceeds. Do not just use them to draw down.
Yeah.
And if you're going to spend it on things that are going to make a difference, whether it's hiring someone that can do with outreach or something. I think the thing is invest the money. Don't just have it there to keep doing what you're always doing, because that's not investing it. That's just kind of, to use that old parable, it's kind of burying it and just doing what you always do.
Yep.
And that's not going to work. So make sure you have a plan on how you're going to use that money, and make sure that you invest it. And investing it can mean putting it through, managed funds and all of that. It can also mean new ministries and new things, but whatever you do, make sure that money is being used to really further the mission of the church, not just to maintain.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also curious, what are some kind of building things? You mentioned not being ADA accessible, deferred maintenance. What are some other things that pastors could see and recognize and be like, yeah, these are kind of stacking up here?
I think just look around the building, see how one of the things is see how it smells. I know that sounds hilarious, but it's for us, it was you could smell how moldy it was. And that was years of not taking care of the building. And so if that's an issue, if you can smell that, anyone who visits is going to smell that.
Yep.
And you might think it's superficial that people are not coming because of a building, but that does matter. And that actually can have some health issues, especially if it's mold or things like that.
Right.
But if you're seeing things that look somewhat dilapidated, you need to have a talk with your people, right away.
Yeah. So you kind of shared to wrap this up a little bit, you kind of shared you still believe in your church. It sounds like your church still believes in your church. What keeps you hopeful, maybe in your context, and then also kind of what words of hope would you share with other pastors who might find themselves in a similar boat?
I think what keeps me hopeful is that there are people there who want to dig in and get involved in the life of the church. And since we've moved, we haven't moved into our own building, at least not at this point. We're sharing space at a Lutheran congregation in another suburb, Roseville. And I think what's been, seeing people engaged in wanting to do what's best for the church, wanting to, I have one of my members, she wants to go and put door hangers on in the neighborhood where we're
Hey,
in.
that's good effort.
And, you want to honor and value
Yeah.
people who want to do that.
Right.
And, there's the sense of fellowship that is there. And I think I see in the worship and everything, there are people who want to be involved. And I think they are still trying to figure out what that is.
Right.
And that's kind of where I come in to help in whatever way. But these people still want to try. They are not, they don't want to just give up. And so that's something I want to honor, and it's something I want to help working with them to see how God can use us in the future.
Is that like a key metric, key measuring thing? Like, do the people, broadly speaking for pastors, like, do your people still want to try?
Yes. I think that is a key metric. I also think that I know it sounds, I don't want to make it sound like, it's all about me, but it's also a pastor that if they want to try, because if a pastor doesn't want to try, or if they, then it's just not going to work.
Right.
But I think that does matter, to have a pastor, to have and a congregation that are both willing to try and see what happens. And, hopefully it will work out. But I think it's better to try than to have just given up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a helpful conversation, and I hope others find it helpful. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Dennis Sanders. And Dennis, thanks for your time today. And some closing questions for you. If you're Pope for a day, what would you like to do with that day?
I think I would want to have people from, especially I think in at least in American context, from evangelical and mainline Protestant backgrounds, to sit and to really listen to each other. I think too much of our modern discourse, we talk at each other instead of to one another. And it's not about trying to agree on everything, because we're not going to. Yeah. But I'd like to have greater chances for us to listen, because maybe in listening, we would at least understand one another and respect one another. Yeah. And I think right now there's just too much there's a lot of talking, but there isn't a lot of listening. And so that's kind of what I would want to do.
Yeah, that'd be pretty good. Pretty good. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think one person that I'd like to meet, because I never did get to meet him, was James Cone. And he was a theologian and kind of responsible for Black theology. He came from, politically from a way different background. And, some of the kind of Marxist stuff is kind of like, I don't really agree with that. But I think his concept and understanding of relating the suffering of Jesus on the cross with the African American experience, especially during Jim Crow, was valuable. And I think helpful for me, and I think helped me also to understand that Black church tradition that I grew up in. And so I would love to, and he only died a few years ago, but I would love to have had a chance to talk to him and learn a little bit more about him.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think they will remember that, and this is kind of related to the first answer, that we didn't really learn to talk to one another. I think the prior generations, especially post World War II, because of that event, that cataclysm, really made people, one, want to cooperate more with one another. And they felt that there might be some things in common.
Yeah.
And I also think that it pushed America forward in many ways, to dealing with issues such as civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and all of that. And we kind of live in an age now where there's less, we feel that there is less in common. I don't know if that's true, but I think we feel that way. So we don't talk to one another, and therefore we don't really find ways of cooperating, find ways of seeking common ground.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I really appreciate your time and having this conversation with me. I hope it's helpful to others who may find themselves in a similar situation. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.